Hello and hi, my name is Sani. I'm the founder and director of AIHLI Legacy. And if you haven't heard, we are running a AIHLI Legacy for Dignity podcast series where we are highlighting critical issues during these 16 days of activism. It is not only important for us to have the conversations that are difficult but challenging, but also adversely taking it into a broader spectrum. AIHLI Legacy is an initiative that really advocates for human rights and is looking at the focal points, not just from a South African or a continental, but a global perspective. And today we have one special guest. Her name is Aisha Adams, and I'm going to be reading her profile because, oh my gosh, we cannot leave anything out. This lady has been doing phenomenal things, and you would have seen her face in the past couple of weeks and her advocacy and how she is really going about really informing and making the right changes, speaking the right terms, and also advocating for the necessary changes, particularly within the gender-based violence and femicide sector. And as we are knowing, the statistics are very horrid. I mean, a woman is affected, impacted directly, indirectly, children as well. And because it's a gender conversation, broadly speaking, it does not leave men out of the conversation. And we will be having a panel of men just highlighting those critical aspects. Now, I don't want to go too deeply into it. As you know, we will be telling you a bit more about who we are right at the end of this particular session. And an introduction of this amazing lady. Her name is Aisha Adam, and she is a Johannesburg-based pharmacist and public health advocate. She holds an honors bachelor of pharmacy from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, an advanced training in pharmaceutical policy and management from the University of the Western Cape. She will be beginning her role as a correctional service pharmacist at Johannesburg Correctional Center in the year 2026. How amazing is that? Following her internship at Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe Hospital, where she led a vaccine outreach campaign. She has, in all means and purposes, played a pivotal role in a national role as the health system within the health system, strengthening as a member of the National Executive Committee of the South African Association of Hospital and Institutional Pharmacists, SAHIP, representing the Young Pharmacist Group. In this capacity, she leads national projects and health promotion campaigns, including a recent outreach initiating initiatives introducing learners from historically marginalized schools to healthcare careers. Aisha has been committed to gender justice and community advocacy, which spans obviously many years. And as a young ambassador for the Active Citizens Movement, she has supported domestic violence shelters, written articles on social issues, and contributed to community outreach for survivors. She has completed training in gender affirming healthcare and constitutional literacy, and previously served as a peer educator for her university regarding HIV and AIDS support unit. And recently, quite recently, she coordinated the Women for Change Silent Lie Down protest in Johannesburg, which is also speaking about the gender-based violence femicide pandemic that we have in this country and why it was so important for us to highlight the critical aspects, which Aisha will be talking about. And beyond that particular initiative and advocacy, she has obviously contributed within the healthcare, and she has accomplished herself, not just within the healthcare, but she is a competitive debater, which is something I loved hearing about Aisha when I met her. I was like, all right, girl. She has adjudicated and does coaching to bring strong skills in the public speaking space, critical analysis, and policy arguments, which you will hear in some of the conversations that she has. And this is grounded in both lived experiences and technical expertise. She works through an intersectional lens, committed to promoting equity, accountability, and social justice across gender-based violence and femicide, the healthcare access, and youth empowerment, and by no means and purposes. Aisha, welcome.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I feel truly so honored to be here, especially working in the healthcare sector, because it's so important that we contribute to these
Mm,
conversations. So, thank you so much for the invitation. I love that we can collaborate to have such discussions because, with the topic of gender based violence, it's going to require a multi sector approach. So, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And it feels so surreal that we just met about 2 months ago and we're working together now.
right?
But I think that's the beauty of community. So thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you very much, Aisha. And indeed, I think obviously just cross-cutting into intersectionality of different avenues where it is important to advocate and also realize where do these human rights aspects arise and how do we as advocates for change really go into these by zoning into those avenues. But before we go deeper into that, Aisha, tell us a bit more about yourself and why it is so important for you to advocate for particularly this avenue not just within the health sector, but broadly going into the gender-based violence and femicide.
So I think that my particular interest has always been in advocating for marginalized groups. With gender-based violence, I think that it also closely links to the healthcare system, which I will talk about a bit later. But it's deeply important because in my own lineage, I've seen so many women go through similar issues, right? Experience gender-based violence, but they didn't have the language for it. And so it's also this inherited consciousness that I have, or understanding and responsibility to voice those issues so that we are able to effectively deal with this issue. So I remember the morning of the silent lie down, I had such heavy feelings, not just because of coordinating, even with coordinating, you're also meant to create a safe space and hold the pain of women, children, and LGBTQIA plus in the country, right? But it was also carrying the pain within my lineage. It's also the understanding that most of us are the first generation to voice these issues and to advocate for actual
Mm.
change. So I think that's why fundamentally, on a personal level, it is incredibly important that I advocate for this issue. But I think professionally as well, and in terms of just being an advocate, it's also important because gender-based violence is intrinsically linked with the healthcare sector. The healthcare sector needs to be a first line response.
Mm, I agree. And I love the fact that you are representing an avenue where we have been in discussions, trying to kind of work through different religions, different backgrounds, different cultures, which inform really the traditional aspects and imposing certain violence into systems that you would naturally not even perceive it. And I love that you are representing women who obviously in generations have not been able to articulate, as you said, rightfully into the context of that. And I want us to just go a bit into the stats just to highlight this and then go into what that means for us as a country, particularly obviously because gender-based violence is a global dynamic and is a challenge everywhere. So here the stats would naturally say that over one third of South African women aged between the age of 18 have experienced either physical, emotional, or inherit that in their lifetime, the violence. And this represented over an estimate of 7.3 million women. And about 9.9% of women have reported experiences of sexual violence in their lifetime. However, we are very much aware that there are so many incidents that are not reported. We see it in the police reports where there is missing cases, there are, mismanagement of the violations of human rights. We see that the justice system has let us down in some avenues, and we are seeing that perpetrators have been amongst us, being able to kind of seep through these avenues. These are in the millions of numbers that we are seeing impacting women, impacting children, and really changing the narrative of growth, development, and experiences. Obviously, because of childhood development and how we grow up and experience life, and we are seeing how we build relationships with other people, this forms a critical aspect of how we become the women we are today. And in us here having this critical conversation, I think the next question is what how should we interpret these particular numbers, these particular complexities, and what is it that we should be looking at from a strategic point rather than, the just looking at it as a general aspect? How do we navigate these very challenging issues from a statistics point of view for South Africa? What does that mean for you as a woman? What does that mean for us?
So I think to understand what the statistics reveal, we also need to understand the history of violence in South Africa, particularly. And that would be rooted in colonialism and apartheid.
Mm.
So we do this thing as a country where we treat the symptoms of the problem, but not the problem itself. If you look at during the colonial period, enslaved women were incredibly sexually exploited during that time. They had establishments of brothels in the Cape that allowed foreign travelers to sexually assault women in these brothels, right? But also enslaved men were forced into positions where they sold their partners into prostitution, right? Or enslaved women. And so, with that, we could also see the rise of intimate partner violence, where the cycle of violence has always been rooted in structural inequality. And I
Mm,
think that until we address that, the problem is going to continue to rise. It's going to continue to escalate because we've always lived in the cycle of violence. I think when colonization happened as well, it also disseminated our communities, our social orders, our structures that we had set up. And instead, it enforced a hierarchy of social order and the prioritization of certain lives above others. And I think that when we talk about the emasculation of enslaved men during that time, we also see a dynamic where they tend to assert control and power over women because of that emasculation. And that's something that we continue to inherit until this day. You've mentioned the fact that we grow up in these environments, we're exposed to violence. Most recently, there was a case where an 8-year-old boy felt tempted to take his life. And we don't really understand why, but we just know that that
mm,
is a huge problem, that an 8-year-old feels so hopeless that the only
mm,
solution is to take their own life. So we see that this cycle of violence has been ingrained in society. So when we look at these statistics, right, we see that there was an increase by 33% in the femicide rate in South Africa. These numbers continue to rise. What does this mean and how can we interpret it to answer your question? So, firstly, we need to understand that the problem is escalating. And this could be because that same lack of power or that structural inequality that existed during apartheid and in the colonial era is still very much present today, but we call it different things. If you look at economic disparity in this country, unemployment, all of those things are still incredibly violent and they reinforce those oppressive systems that were once established, something that's completely foreign to us, right? And secondly, then we can link it to the fact that we're not addressing these issues. So we talk about
mm,
reform a lot. In these conversations, we're like, okay, if we establish policing desks or units in SAPS, then the problem will cease to exist. But no, you're treating a symptom. And even then, too, which we will get into a bit later, women and marginalized communities cannot easily access these institutions. So what we can importantly gauge from the statistic is that with the institutions that we currently have, they have been established during apartheid and colonial times. We are simply asking for reform to make that exact same system better, but it's continuing to fail us because those systems are inherently built on violence. They're not meant to protect our communities, especially South African people, right? And I think that's why we're seeing this perpetual increase because we refuse to acknowledge what the problem actually is. And until we do that, I fear that we may continue seeing the increase in violence.
mm. I love that you unpacked it in that way because as we initially started the conversation, we went into how traditional and how our avenues of systematic development, or we have inherited these issues from one generation to the other in the
Mhm.
manner in which we are taught how to build relationships, which are impacting the way that we view ourselves currently. And the issues that continue to perpetuate this particular statistics, we look at how also the substance use disorder and the abuse of all these
Yes.
things are growing in numbers and are contributing to gender-based violence and femicide. We're not really having conversations on contributing factors, as you say. We are looking at it as,
Mhm.
oh, we are dealing with them in isolation, which is another issue.
Yes.
Because if we were just to sit and really have a frank conversation, we would realize, as you said, these have been there. We have inherited colonial systems. We still
Mm.
live in the colonial systems. Nothing really has transformed from that perspective. And the challenge with that is that we're carrying on as if it's business as usual. Even the concept of the aspects of Rainbow Nation, we don't really live up to it. And in that particular emphasis is that the margins of inequality are so big, and because of that we are seeing people that are desperate. We are dealing with people that are now having a heightened level of mental health issues or challenges
Yes.
rather. We are seeing more men be homeless. We are seeing more pressures from social media, and we are seeing how placing people in these environments is also making them desperate. It's also making them
Yes.
want things that are far from them to reach, sorry. And they are now trying to kind of reach out to things that are not realistic, that are not practical, because in the environments we live in, there is no space for healthy individuals to live. And
Yes.
this is causing such a big imbalance, because now we are dealing with people that are hurt, broken, or feeling lost, as you said. How concerning is it that it is normal in this day and age for an 8 year old to want to take their own life? How does that make sense? What is it that you're going through at the age of 8 that makes you want to take your own life, as you
Mm.
rightfully asked the question? And we are not addressing these fundamental issues. And until we do, we are still going to have the same conversations, and we are still going to go around
Mhm.
the same cycles. And because of slavery and how we people as in a general context was sold off, we haven't dealt with that.
Mm.
We haven't dealt with the facts that our ancestors were seen as commodities. They were seen as items that could be sold off. And because of that environment, they have been victimized. And until we have frank conversations and dive deeper into that, maybe let's start to speak about the constructs of advocacy in the country. I know that we are raising our voices and we are having the conversations, but I think a fundamental question is that enough? And if it's not enough, how do we continue to advocate and break the barriers from breaking from informing knowledges, from breaking stereotypes, to kind of introducing new, healthier ways to deal with fundamental issues and finding solutions? So the question here in particular is that with the landscape of South Africa's gender-based violence currently, how do we transform the advocacy aspects?
So we also need to consider the measures that are currently being taken by government, right? In
Mm,
2019, there was a national strategic plan for gender-based violence that was set
yes.
up, but we see that it lacked implementation and coordination. And also, the work done there didn't actually do much to transform the narrative around gender-based violence. Again, it was just treating a symptom of gender-based violence. So, what we saw there was that there was an establishment of a police desk at SAP's offices, right? But even then, most people in SAPs or in the policing services don't have enough training to support survivors. And that's a huge problem because they also don't know how to direct survivors to shelters as well. So, when we see that coordination and implementation aspect of the national strategic plan, we think that it's failing for that reason, for the fact that we cannot organize. And even though we talk about organizing on a national, provincial, and even on a local level, we also need to understand that it requires every sector to get involved in this conversation in order to change
Mm,
that narrative. This isn't a conversation that only should exist in the legal system or only in the
mm,
policing system or the criminal justice system, but in every sector and fabric of society, because the way we socialize as people is intrinsically linked to that violence, right? Because with violence, we need to understand that it's not just the external, it's also the internal. It exists in the body, in the mind, and in the psyche. So we need educational programs and intervention at a very young age as well. This includes
mm,
having conversations about sexuality with kids from a young age. If you look at teenage pregnancy in South Africa, it's incredibly concerning that during 2023 to the 2024 period, there was 122,000 young girls that fell pregnant. So, with
Mm,
teenage pregnancy, then it still could be linked to a form of gender based violence, such as coercion, control, grooming. So, we need to start having those conversations as well. Particularly, then, in the healthcare sector, we need to understand that gender based violence is a public health crisis. So, why I say this is because survivors often go to the healthcare sector to get support. And this is also evidence for prosecution, right? The completion of the J88 form is done in the healthcare sector, but also
mm,
support in terms of women's health. Because when you go to seek this support, you're also given things like emergency contraception. You're also given things like post exposure prophylaxis to prevent HIV. So, your public health
mm,
sector has to be well resourced. We need to talk about how 2 billion was stolen from Tembisa Hospital. We're only coming to find out what that 2 billion was used for when that could be used to
mm,
support survivors. So, those are the types of conversations we need to be having. How can every sector play a role in getting involved in this issue, in creating this transformation that we need, right? Specifically in
mm,
healthcare, that also needs to come with the prioritization of gender based violence and response units in clinics. Because, yes, we do have Tutuzela crisis centers, but we also need to see that there's only a handful in each province, at least five. So, most people likely have access to a nearby clinic or healthcare facility where they can access treatment, right? So that's just in
mm,
terms of response. This response doesn't just require NGO sectors, but it requires every sector of society. Healthcare is just one example of that. Then, in terms of transformation, with the national strategic plan, it's also promised that there's going to be prioritization into research of this issue. So we need to see consistent reporting of that research that needs to be made public to the citizens of South Africa and civil society. Because what research are you doing? It's not enough to say we're doing research on the escalating violence or we're reporting numbers and statistics to you. No, we want research on the root cause
mm,
of the problem. You need to analyze the historical context of violence in South Africa. So, with the National Strategic Plan, it's important to hold the government accountable to the promises that they've made in this layout. Because, yes, it is beautiful, but we aren't going to get anywhere unless we hold the government accountable for implementation of such. Similarly, if we look at COVID-19, that was also a national disaster. Funds from
mm,
the COVID-19 relief were stolen, they were misallocated, and we cannot allow for that to happen with gender-based violence, especially in the Gender-Based Violence Command Council. They talk about a committee that's going to manage funds. Who's in this committee? How do we hold them
mm,
accountable? Since 2019 and since the total shutdown movement, we haven't gotten reporting as to how money allocated for gender-based violence has been utilized. Instead, we've just been told that, yes, we gave 1.6 billion, it has been utilized, but where? Is it going towards research? Is it going towards implementing the national strategic plan? We have no idea. So, we as a country need to also take accountability and responsibility. We elect people into power because we
mm,
have a democracy. And so it is our obligation to then hold those same people accountable, because if you elect people into power, there's obviously a trust that's placed there. And if you see that trust is weakening, then it's your responsibility to call it out. So, apart from
mm,
just accountability and transparency, I think grassroots movements are so crucial when we talk about social advocacy, because with grassroots movements, I feel like they are more connected to the community they serve on the ground level.
mm,
Okay. Policy here is not just enough. We have a
mm,
beautiful constitution, we have a national strategic plan, we need to talk implementation. And so I think working with grassroots organizations is also crucial, because then you get insight into lived realities from the communities that they work with. So grassroots play an incredible role. Conclusively, then, your idea of transformation. I think transformation has multiple avenues, and we keep getting it wrong where we try to put a face to a problem in South Africa. If our
Mm.
healthcare system is not working, oh, it must be foreigners who are taking up space. No, we don't look at the structural reasons as to why systems are failing. So it's then our responsibility to analyze those systems, to understand those problems on a deeper and more complex level so that they don't perpetuate and repeat themselves. So, in conclusion to your idea of transformation, there are multiple ways to achieve this liberation. No one single actor can, spur up a whole transformation movement. It's going to require collective effort and collective solidarity in order to achieve this.
I fully agree. And I think one of the other avenues that we are also getting a little bit challenged with is not just the accountability measure, but the processing of theory into practicality. We as a country are very good at developing declarations, policies, the
Mhm.
Constitution in itself. We have such a rich, you know, binding law. And in terms of the implementation, taking it from theory to practicality has been quite a challenge. And then that is coupled with corruption, which is also a
Yes.
bigger challenge because now what we do have in place for it to be implemented, we need resources. Now, the
Mm,
resources that are allocated, as you rightfully highlighted, are misplaced, are mismanaged, and we don't know who, when, how, or why if they are not going to the people that are the beneficiaries of these particular services that they need.
mm,
And as you say, because we are not focusing on that particular issue, we are then always being placed with distractions. I feel like we are always distracted with so many other things. Like now we're looking at the commission, now we're looking at all these different things, and we are hearing intricate, very concerning things, particularly coming from a safety and security perspective, where fundamentally this issue we are talking about is spearheaded by that particular sector. And if it is not having its house in order, it's a challenge because that means what else can they do if what is happening inside is not able to manage, control, enforce, and hold
yes.
people accountable from a legal perspective, from a security perspective outside of its own system. And we are thankful also for our country to now undergo this process as well, because then it means we are trying to do something about what is not working.
Mm,
Rightfully, I agree with you as well when you say that we cannot hold a face to the problem and say this is the solution or this is the
mm,
person that will be our savior.
yes.
It is not going to work because right, there was a lady who highlighted something very profound to me. She was like, you can change the leader, but internally the system is already rotten. The problem
Mm,
is that there are some people who are in office that are the problem. Now you bring a new face, you bring a new head, the
yeah.
body is still not functioning well. There are ailments within the organs. We need
Yes.
to look at how are we refining this. And I love the fact that we are going deeper into these avenues and looking at transformation from a holistic perspective
Mm,
because we need as a society, as individuals to rise up. No one's coming to save us. I've said this, I don't know how many times. We need to rise up. We need to be able to be visible, to know who and when and why they are doing what they're doing. And you made mention of a very critical issue that our healthcare system with organizations or with, political or affiliated parties that want to say foreigners are our problem. And the reality is they might seem like part of the problem, but the bigger issue is our resources are not going to where they
mm,
are needed. And if we don't address that, we'll always have these conversations saying, okay, how are we managing um, simple things like HIV and AIDS? How are we managing making sure that women and children are safe and secure and making sure that all people irrespective of their preferences can be able to live in a country that reflects the rainbow nation, that reflects these aspects of
mm,
constitutionality. Now now we are going off now. I want us now to go deeper into these advocacy movements and why it is so important for us to even be talking about this. How are we fundamentally changing the narrative and the status quo? And why is it so important for us to take more of a leadership role? I want you to please just take us into your confidence by walking us through the Women for Change, the importance of the timeliness, why it had to be now that we are spearheading and now forging ahead with affirming gender-based violence and femicide as a disaster for us in this country. And this is where I want us to walk through. So maybe just introduce the idea of where did it come from, how did you participate, and why is it important that more than 1 million signatures came and women are saying we want change.
With the shutdown that happened, there was actually a bit of a preamble to the whole movement. So, Women for Change originally submitted a proposal to government to declare gender-based violence a national disaster, but that proposal was rejected. And so I think that with the shutdown that happened, it was mainly something that was a follow-up to deliver for citizens in South Africa, especially when we've been ignored, when marginalized communities have not been prioritized, when our safety is constantly on the line every single day. And I think that it came at the time of the G20 because at the G20, it's an event where leaders meet to discuss economic progress. So, one of the objectives with the shutdown was also for women, LGBTQIA plus people, and children to withdraw from the economy, both socially and also on a financial level as well. So, this included not participating in any paid or unpaid labor. So it was really about a withdrawal from society to highlight that we have built your economy and we do contribute to the society. Therefore, it is important that you value our lives and care if we are being killed at a violent rate. So I
Mm,
think that's just about the history of how exactly this came about. And why it was so important because we have been having these conversations. Our president acknowledged that it is a crisis back in 2019, but we haven't seen delivery. So, this push for it being a national disaster was also to enable the disaster management plan. So, it's basically a plan to take extraordinary measure to combat gender-based violence and to understand this problem. It's also a matter of allocation of resources because now it allows for funds to be pulled from certain sectors in government to be allocated to gender-based violence relief and also to solving that problem. That's why it was particularly important. So, what we saw then at the G20 is that the president declared it a national disaster. But as you've mentioned, it has gotten 1 million signatures, and that those signatures are not just South Africans. It's also a global
mm,
and international problem. We've gotten support from African countries, we've gotten support from Ghana, from Nigeria, even in the UK internationally as well, because gender-based violence is a global issue.
mm,
However, I think that it's very important for me to emphasize this because when we have this conversation, we blanket everyone in the same group where we say, yes, it's all women. Yes, it's all queer people. Yes, it's all children. And as much as that is true, we are still disproportionately affected based on the way your systems of oppression that you're forced into intersect. So,
mm,
for example, a lesbian woman who's living in poverty is more um, likely to experience violence than a middle class straight woman. So, those are things that we need to analyze. When we talk about this response, it can't just be a blanket solution like the National Strategic Plan. If you go through it, it doesn't make provision for certain identities and what they experience uniquely to them. It can't just be support anymore, it has to be a system where we are able to look at this through an intersectional lens, right? That means dissecting things like poverty, disability, sexuality, gender identity, because all of those things do shape your lived experience and ultimately how you interact with violence. If you look at transgender people, they are also deterred from accessing public health institutions
mm,
because they feel that. they're going to be unsafe in those institutions. The problem then is with the healthcare system and the staff that exist in those institutions, not with the community itself. So, how can we better show up for them? In the National
Mm.
Strategic Plan, it also talks about social cohesion. But how exactly are we going to implement that social cohesion? Because no DNA, just RSA is not cutting it at this point. When we
That
talk
is
about
so
social
true.
cohesion, we have to collaborate between the identities. We have to form some
Mm.
cohesion between the different races, the different genders, the different sexuality. But it also means government implementing structures that are going to create safe spaces for these marginalized communities in societies. It could be something as simple as also having gender neutral bathrooms to accommodate for gender non-conforming people as well. So there are multiple ways that we can create the social cohesion, but words are not just enough. We need actual structural changes in order to drive this conversation. And I think that's why it's so important that we're having it right now, because
Mm.
after the national shutdown that we saw, the women shutdown, G20 shutdown, it ran into 16 days of activism. So, apart from it just being strategic in terms of getting international exposure or applying pressure to government, on an advocacy level, it allows for that conversation and momentum to continue. Because in order to enable these structural changes or keep the conversation going, we need applied pressure. So I think that it was also strategic on that level because it
Mm.
allowed for nationwide accountability, but also it allows the conversation to continue into 16 days of activism. So I think that was really brilliant. That was why it was so important during that time. But as much as we can say it is important, this is an amazing thing that's happening, it's important to acknowledge that lives are still currently being lost. They have been
Mm.
lost because as a nation, we have failed them. We have failed to respond historically to this crisis. Even during apartheid, right? When you look at the women's movement that happened then, women were never invited into the making of the democracy.
Exactly.
Nobody pulled out a chair for them. That is something that they advocated for. We've been having conversations about marital rape, even amongst white people, right? Incest and marital rape was also common. Women experienced that during apartheid by
Mm.
the hands of their white partners. But that was also something that was very coveted or discreet in society to protect the idea of white morality. So during women's struggle, then, during apartheid, there was a prioritization on achieving democracy because it was said to be this thing that's going to free us all. Again, another
Mm.
blanketed statement. So that's where the
Mm.
prioritization came in. We never prioritized social issues. We never prioritized intimate partner violence. And I
Mm.
think those are conversations we can now start to unpack because historically we haven't done that for the longest time. But it's really empowering that we do begin to drive these changes. So when I spoke about earlier why this is important to me in terms of having this voice, being able to speak on issues that my lineage haven't been able to, it's
Mm.
a very similar thing as well, right? It's a matter of also understanding my own identity. What is my culture?
Mm.
Sometimes when we have this conversation about violence, we say that, okay, it's intrinsic in our culture. We just have
Mm.
patriarchal cultures. But the
Mm.
problem is also that with colonization, it was so violent that it also diluted our cultures. That colonial
Mm.
identity merged with our indigenous identity or cultural identities. So sometimes we can't even navigate what's ours and what's foreign to us. For example, in India, during pre-colonial times, women didn't wear the blouses, right, with their saris or the tops. That's
Mm.
something that was introduced by colonial parties and colonial powers, but it's now something that's ingrained in our culture. If I'm wearing a sari or traditional outfit, I am going to wear that top, right? Because it's seen to be
Mm.
modest. Otherwise, it's immodest. But we never operated that way. We never had that social order. It was something that was introduced to us. So, on a personal level, that's why this conversation is so important to me, not just to be a voice in this conversation, but also to understand my own identity. What is
Mm.
intrinsic to me? And with the South African identity, then, or my nationality, what is intrinsic to us as a nation? And how do we
Mm.
also get rid of these problems that have been exposed to us. And I 100% agree that certain cultural practices can also be problematic, right? But then you need to platform people who are in that culture to speak on that issue. We
Mm,
don't need saviors, as you rightfully said, to speak on cultural matters. We need people within that community to voice those concerns on a national level. What can we do
mm,
about it? Oftentimes, when you come from certain cultures, you're seen as being kind of a traitor, like you're subscribing to Western feminism when you have these conversations about empowerment. But that's not true, because even when you look at the women's movement in South Africa during apartheid, that was also led by women of color, right? South African
yes.
women. And so this idea of women's liberation isn't something that is Western. It's not something that is unique to us. We have it. It does exist, right? And we need to get rid of the idea that women empowerment is Western feminism. You get white feminism,
Mm,
but when we talk
mm,
about empowerment within our communities, we also have to create a form of liberation that serves our communities. So, exactly as you mentioned, not just adopting theory, but implementing new strategy, having conversations within our community, but also on a national platform as to how we can do better. Is this really our culture? Or is it something that has been introduced into our culture that now forms part of our identity? So I think that's what it means for us as a nation, but also me on a personal level. Thank you so much for
mm.
that question. I feel like I'm just rambling
Oh,
and going
no, 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 no,
on at
no.
this
I think
point.
you're clarifying some of the avenues of why it is important for us to lead these advocacies. Why is it important to see it through? Because historically, women have tried. They have done their part. And then intrinsically, it becomes our responsibility for our generation to continue to actually refine the ideas. I think even with looking at how opportunities were not readily available to women in previous generations. Ours is quite unique because we come from a position of, you could say, privilege to a certain extent.
Yes.
Privilege in a sense that we have access to education, we have access to higher education, we have access to having a career, even though it has its own challenges. And then the picture of what a woman ought to be is refined and changing on a day-to-day
Mhm.
basis, and we are grappling with the ideas of modernizing, as you say, like they are saying we are Western or we are Westernizing the ideology of what a woman ought to be. And when you're advocating for certain things, is then bringing in the colonial aspects of, oh no, but you are bringing something that is foreign to us. But the reality is, as you say as well, understanding our roots is important so that we know where we're going and why we are making decisions that we are making them in the way that we are making them, and what informs the ideas behind that, and how we as a people are continue to evolve, which is right, because if we are stagnant, we are not doing anything different. So with us as women talking about such a very important aspect of a very broad conversation on gender, where there is violence that is based within this ideology, and we are seeing it as coming at the cost of our peace, coming at the cost of our safety, coming at the cost of women feeling secure in any space they find themselves, where there is more men than there are women, and how being a woman is looked at as being vulnerable, and in
Yeah.
your strength you're needing to find your voice. And you articulated that so beautifully, and I understand also why it is so important for us to refine what does it mean for us as a country when we say, okay, now gender-based violence is considered at a national level to be a disaster, and now we are needing to spearhead this advocacy, and we are needing to look at it from a holistic approach and not rush it, because I think so many times we are so quick to find the wordings so easily and put them in, but also keeping in mind of how critically of a crisis it is that we have women dying on a day-to-day basis. We have
Mhm.
women being sacrificed. We have people who are, dying, or their lives are being lost, and we are not finding solutions to that. How do we come together and find resolutions that speak to accountability, making sure the justice system is effective, making sure that what has been put in place with the intent of making sure there's order it is enforced. How challenging can this one idea be? Why is it so challenging for everybody just to do their part? And it is then speaking to what is it that we are dealing with. I think there's so many underlying issues from an individual, family, and then obviously community perspective. And I love the fact that you also had mentioned that um, grassroots and women's voices are focal at this moment. And I want us
Mm.
to go into how are we holding space for one another as women? Why is that important?
Yes.
What are the toxic traits that we really bring into spaces that are not necessary? Why can't we just be there for each other?
Mm.
And why do we have the crab system going on? We drag each other down. Why can't we just really be there and maybe hold space? What does that look like for Aisha? And why do you think it's important for women to spear or to kind of take that baton and move with it?
If anything, history has shown us it's that when women stand together, the nation moves. If you look at the
Mm,
Women's March that took place, that required collective power and collective solidarity. Most
mm,
recently, if you look at the national shutdown that happened on the 21st of November, that was also collective power and collective unity. So
mm,
we've always been stronger together. This concept of women having an immense power to collectivize has always been our greatest tool. And that's something that we need to remember. It's the only thing that has ever worked for us and will continue to work for us. Even in this conversation that we've had, we've spoken about how every sector of society needs to get involved in order to implement solutions, but also to identify the root problem that is going to require collective power, especially from women, right? During this time also of the national shutdown, we've also seen protests erupt at WITS and at UCT by students protecting women, right?
mm,
Because they have been identified to be survivors in that institution, but also perpetrators in that institution. That is also a
mm,
form of collectivizing, of women protecting women, of society protecting women. So that's why it's important in order to protect each other, but also to drive collective change. Because historically, we've seen that pattern with women collectivizing. Even most recently, we've seen what happens when women collectivize. When having this
mm,
conversation, we also need to talk about accountability. That so
mm,
much of our social behavior is learned behavior. So much of it can also come from things such as internalized misogyny. That is to say that if you are subjected to misogyny or patriarchy, which every woman is, right, just to varying degrees,
mm,
you then internalize that and then you enact that in your social behavior with other women. So it could be things like body shaming, but it could also be things like blocking women from accessing opportunities, right?
mm,
So when having this conversation, we've also spoken about not attaching a face to the problem, because as much as we do identify men being the perpetrators in this conversation, we also need to have a conversation about what enables those structures to exist.
mm,
Who's protecting those structures, right? So with women, then it's important for us to analyze our own behaviors and how we interact with other women. We need to ensure that we are not upholding those exact same structures. With marginalized communities, sometimes even though they may not look like the oppressor, they can have the oppressor mindset because it becomes so normalized, right? Violence is not just something
mm,
external, but we spoke about how it's in the it's in the mind, body, in the psyche as well. So
mm,
women, then we also need to do the work to dissect all of these thinking patterns. We need to do the work to identify our internalized misogyny and how that plays a role in our social life. For example, if you look at mothers, I know this is very common in Indian culture as well, where they tend to protect
mm,
their sons when they commit violent and abusive behavior.
mm,
That is also a woman who is enabling that system of violence, who's protecting violence at that point. So, yes, hold perpetrators accountable, hold men accountable. But this conversation requires every identity to get involved
Mm,
and not just pin a face to it, but understand the social pinnings of these problems, to understand the structures of it, right? Even when you have a conversation about the mental health crisis in South Africa, 90% of people who experience mental health problems don't have access to treatment, right? One in three South Africans will experience a mental health crisis in their lifetime. So, when having this conversation about perpetrators, I understand that sometimes it is anger from women, and rightfully
mm,
so. But we also need to understand, how do we support people with these problems so that violence isn't something that continues to exist in society. In the capacity we hold, not just socially, but professionally as well. There are a lot of women in healthcare systems, right? That's also becoming very popular. In my own profession in pharmacy, it is a woman majority profession. What are we doing in our capacity, in our
mm,
immediate settings to drive this form of change? So I think that's sort of the conversations that need to happen amongst women. It's not to say that you need to coddle your oppressors or you need to coddle the perpetrators, but it's also to extend a thinking of compassion and empathy as to how we can be better. With this conversation that we have, a lot of the times we push for policing reform, or we push for life imprisonment. We push that men's genitals be removed. But those aren't tangible solutions that's going to solve the
mm,
problem, because most of the
mm.
time, and we've spoken about this, women don't actually have much support in these policing systems. When it comes to court cases and reporting, only 8%, approximately 8% of cases actually see conviction of prosecutors, right? Sorry, of perpetrators.
A
So
perpetrator.
even when we're having this conversation, then we also need to have it on a more social and cultural and systemic level as well, as to how we can do better. Um, so there are multiple ways that we can have this conversation, but I think it's going to firstly start by looking inwardly. How are you contributing to the system? How are you upholding the system? But most importantly, what can you do? I think sometimes, especially with violence or survivors of gender-based violence, it can make you feel so powerless and voiceless and isolated.
Mm,
So that's why it's important for us to collectivize and to create solidarity. At the lie down, we also saw so many women be vulnerable because they felt safe. So it's important for us to also create those safe spaces. When your homegirl
mm,
comes to you like, hey, I actually got back with my abusive boyfriend, you don't just cut her off. And we have also adopted this idea where we want to protect our mental health or preserve our
mm,
peace, whatever that means. But what people are not willing to sit with is, in order to transform, you need to be willing to be uncomfortable. You have to compromise. You have to extend compassion, even when it requires the most from you. So, even if it may not be on a macro level, policy level, implementation, coordination, there are ways you can show up in your social life. Show up for your friend who's in an abusive relationship. How can you support her? If you can't support her financially, can you support her emotionally? Take on responsibility for other people apart from yourself. Don't just take responsibility for your daughters or for your own life or for the women in your family. Also take collective responsibility for women and for marginalized identities around you, because those are the ways we can start showing up. Everyone in their capacity has a role to play.
mm,
Oftentimes, also, when we have this conversation, we say that government needs to implement this law, they need to implement A, B, and C in the criminal justice system. And the flaws of the criminal justice system, that is a conversation for another day. But we don't introspect, what can we do in our capacity? Who
mm,
is government? Government is made up of ordinary citizens who started off in positions just like us, right? Who started having these conversations. We trusted them, we elected them. And
mm,
I think that we create these social power paradigms in our mind where we see ourselves removed from enacting change. Change can only come from a higher level. But that's not true, because if we all start showing
Mm,
up, there are so many things that we could change in society. Government has a role in terms of policy, regulation, also implementation, coordination. But we still have a role socially. Have conversations with your sons about consent, about power dynamics, because that is what's going to change how we operate on a social day-to-day level. Hold the men in your life accountable, but also hold the woman in your life accountable. If your homegirl
mm,
comes up to you, just talking shit or whatever, call her out on it. Don't be afraid to do that. So
mm.
that accountability really needs to come internally before we see the changes externally.
Mm, yes, I agree. And I think you have encompassed the answers to, you know, ensuring that we as people, community, family, individuals, strangers in particular,
Mm.
we have shown that we are able to come together and stand united. We've also shown that we are capable of also showing up when it is important to do so in terms of
Mm.
visibility, in terms of activity, and making sure that this issue is prioritized from a national level. And then going into our individual spaces, the relationships we build, and as you say, rightfully, because I think there's been this issue of protecting my
Mm.
peace, and you alienate people from your life
Mm.
because you're protecting your peace, but we are also not understanding or appreciating that we are all going through something, and we are all
Yes.
dealing with it in the best way we think we are capable of. And it is then fundamentally important to kind of take yourself, and this was last year's slogan, put yourself in their shoes, and not necessarily to enable, but to walk with them.
Yes.
It is also important to identify what are the needs of your friend. What is it
Mm.
that she is yearning for that keeps her going back into these cycles? There's only
Yes.
so much that you can do, but it is so
Mm.
important that you also walk with her, take into
Yes.
spaces where conversations about mental health and wellness are had, having conversations with women like we are having conversation now, put her in spaces where she could be empowered and then have
Yes.
self realization that, oh, I'm possibly needing to do X, Y, and
Mm.
Z. Maybe I'm needing therapy and I'm needing to unpack these things and have a moment with myself. And I think we are missing that. We
Yes,
are
I love
missing
that.
we're missing the Ubuntu aspect. I think
Mm.
that's what was emphasized a lot during the G20 Ubuntu, but I don't think we embody
Yeah.
that. We really maybe don't understand it fully because I think saying words and actions are two different things. I even personally I can recall, as you say, I recall also losing friends to issues of whether it be related to the decisions they make or the decisions I make. But I
Mm.
think nobody's perfect. We need
Yes.
to be able to give each other opportunities to learn from our mistakes. And it is okay to not be okay, as my sister likes to say. And I
That is
want
beautiful. I love the way you phrased all of this. Thank you.
Yes, and I want us to now hone into key takeaways. We've spoken so lengthy about different avenues from government and its responsibility, its role in implementation, in enforcement, and then us as a community coming to the picture to hold them accountable for the things they are committing themselves to, and also keeping in mind that a new face in terms of elections is about to come into the picture, which then says, how do we then take what has already been committed and spearhead it forward with whomever comes in? And then how do we break systems that are really not serving its communities? And then how do we reach grassroots communities? How do we empower the SAPS? How do we maybe advocate for the changes within the SAPS that will speak informatively to social issues, addressing them from a technical, from a social, and from all these stakeholders that are needed within these spaces, And how do we navigate those? And it's
Mm,
so complex and it's so broad that we have been able to articulate all of it so accurately, because what we are in essence saying is we are the change that is needed. Our contribution, our voices, our actions after we have spoken are needed. And it is so important that we not only say we are advocating, we are changing, we are learning, we are also saying we are transforming and we are
mm,
adapting. And because of that, we want everything else to adapt simultaneously as we transform. And
mm.
I want you to give you this opportunity for any last words that you'd like to share, particularly on how do people participate with Women for Change? How do we get a hold of you? How do we volunteer? How do we make sure that what has been shared from an advocacy perspective is shared holistically within the communities, whether it be with my friends at church, ho- however small, how do we really make sure the movement stays alive?
Very importantly, when we talk about transformation, it doesn't just happen overnight. There seems
Mm,
to be this false narrative that transformation or reform, at least, is a one-time event, but it's something that
mm,
requires sustained effort and advocacy. And it looks different on different days. Some days it may
mm,
look like sitting at a policy table having conversations about legislation. Other days it may look like showing up in your community for outreach drives. But
mm,
on most days, it's going to be the social part of it. How are you interacting with your close friends or the intimate people in your life? Are you making space for women and gender non-conforming identities? How are you socializing with them? And I love that you also spoke about the practical ways women can start showing up for each other, apart from just dialogue as well. So that's what I hope we're able to achieve with this conversation, to help people understand that every sector of society needs to get involved in this transformation,
mm,
because it's not something that is an isolated issue. It's not a single issue. As Audre Lorde put it, we don't live single issue lives, right? It's going to require
mm,
transformation from multiple sectors, socially, culturally, but especially on a structural and systemic level. So
mm,
I think that would be the takeaway message from this conversation about how we can sustain advocacy, to understand that it's going to look different on different days, and they are all
mm,
equally important, and they are all equally and powerful. If you're having a conversation about social cohesion at a policy table, right, whether it's in
mm,
parliament or whatever government sector, the next day you could practically apply social cohesion in your personal life, as we mentioned, having that conversation with your friend who's in an abusive relationship, right? Guiding her to the correct resources. So we also need to understand that as much as we are politically there or intellectually there, it's very important that we are also socially there as well in
mm.
our daily engagements with people. So I think that would be my greatest takeaway message that I'd like people to go home with, that we can show up every single day, and it's important that we do show up every single day. In terms of how to get involved with Women for Change, they have a website with their details on it. You can reach out to them via email. How you can get in touch with me, also my email address, I can share it with you. That's AISHADAM09 at gmail.com. So it's basically Aisha Dam or Aisha Adam, however you want to say it. I created it when I was like probably 9 years old. So that's how you can reach out to me. But yeah, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation that we're having right now, because it's very important for me to live my values, and I'm sure that it is for
Mm,
you. So when we're talking about intersectoral collaboration, this is also an example of it. I usually don't exist in law spaces or
mm,
humanitarian work spaces per se, even though my work
mm,
is rooted in humanitarian humanitarianism. I mean, they exist in healthcare spaces, but we're still able to have this conversation to reach a mutual understanding about what needs to be done. And I like to see that reflected in society where we start collaborating with each other. It's not enough anymore to just hold a face to a problem because it's easy for us to scapegoat. We need to do the difficult work to unpack these conversations, to unpack what does transformation mean to us and what does it look like, because again, as Audre Lorde put it, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Thank you so much for having me here today and to be a part of this very important and powerful conversation. And thank you especially for
Oh,
the work that you're doing.
oh, thank you so much, Aisha, not just for your time, but for the work that you're doing in office, out of office. As you say, holding space and wearing different hats, advocating where it's necessary, showing up in the form that is needed for when it is required, and always having your voice articulated throughout each and every avenue of that. I speak from personal experience. I've seen you, just go in hard and show your passion for advocacy, and I've loved every part of it. And thank you so much. I am humbled for your time and you just sharing these very critical aspects. And as we continue to advocate, we will continue to light and spearhead these issues. And from myself and Aisha, I would like to thank you for not only listening, but also being encouraged to take up space, hold it, and make sure that you are getting in touch with the right resources, people. There are organizations available that are willing to help you and meet you where you are. Being vulnerable is your strength, mental health is your wealth. Make sure that you are showing up in the best way possible. Gender-based violence and femicide now as a national disaster in our country is now our responsibility as all genders to take up its responsibility. Let us hold them accountable. Let us inform what it goes into it, the way it will be implemented, the way it will be articulated, the way it will be enforced in all our small grassroots or isolated areas. Let us hold perpetrators accountable. Let us seek for justice system to be more firm and not lenient to those who are perpetrators. It is important for people who have experienced unfortunate violence to feel safe again and be given the opportunity to heal. So, from myself and Aisha, once again, thank you so much. Aisha's contact details or email address rather and Women for Change website will be shared on this particular podcast series, and just for your information so that you can be able to get in touch with her. From us to you, God bless and goodbye.